There are moments when silence becomes louder than words, when the absence of communication speaks more powerfully than any conversation could convey. What occurred on the Family Feud stage in July 2025 was one of those extraordinary moments when years of unspoken pain and unresolved conflict manifested as silence so profound and uncomfortable that it dominated the entire studio. A father and son who had not spoken to each other in 15 years found themselves competing on opposite sides of the Family Feud stage, neither knowing the other would be present, and the tension that built between them became so overwhelming that production could not continue. When Steve Harvey finally broke through that silence with words that would force both men to confront the years of hurt and stubbornness that had destroyed their relationship, he facilitated one of the most powerful moments of reconciliation ever witnessed on television. This is not merely a story about a game show disrupted by family conflict. This is a story about the devastating cost of pride, the corrosive effect of unresolved anger, and the courage required to break through silence and rebuild what has been lost. Before proceeding with this account, if you value stories that remind us of the importance of communication and reconciliation in family relationships, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like button and subscribing. Your engagement enables us to share stories that address the fundamental importance of maintaining family bonds, even through difficult circumstances. Thomas Reynolds stood at the Family Feud podium at 67 years old, presenting the appearance of a man who had achieved conventional measures of success through decades of disciplined work and careful planning. Thomas had built a successful career as a senior engineer at an aerospace company, having worked for the same organization for 42 years before retiring 3 years earlier. He was known among colleagues and friends as reliable, methodical, and somewhat rigid in his thinking and expectations. Thomas had been married to his wife Margaret for 44 years, and together they had raised 3 children in a suburban home characterized by structure, high expectations, and limited tolerance for deviation from established plans and values. Thomas came from a generation and family background that emphasized hard work, personal responsibility, and adherence to traditional paths to success. His own father had been a strict disciplinarian who had demanded academic and professional achievement from his children, and had showed limited patience for artistic pursuits, emotional expression, or career paths that deviated from conventional definitions of success. Thomas had internalized many of these values and had applied them in raising his own children, believing that he was providing them with the structure and expectations necessary for successful lives. The Reynolds family team included Thomas, his wife Margaret, their daughter Patricia, who was 40 years old and worked as a hospital administrator, their younger son Mark, who was 35 and worked in finance, and Patricia's husband, who was an accountant. The family members all shared certain characteristics including professional success, conventional career paths, and a general adherence to the values and expectations that Thomas had established for his family. They appeared to outside observers as a successful, accomplished family unit. However, there was a conspicuous absence in the Reynolds family composition. Thomas and Margaret had not 2 children, but 3. Their eldest son, James Reynolds, was 43 years old and had been estranged from his father Thomas for 15 years. The estrangement had begun when James made decisions about his life and career that Thomas could not accept or support, and it had hardened over the years into a complete rupture of communication that neither man had been able or willing to bridge. Standing at the opposing podium, representing the competing family, was James Reynolds. At 43, James had built a life that looked nothing like what his father had envisioned or planned for him. But it was a life characterized by authenticity, creativity, and meaningful relationships, even if it lacked the conventional markers of success that Thomas valued. James worked as a professional photographer specializing in documentary work, a career that provided modest income but allowed him to pursue artistic vision and to tell stories about communities and individuals often overlooked by mainstream society. James had never married, but maintained a committed long-term partnership with a man named Daniel, a relationship that had been part of what prompted the estrangement from his father. James had known from a young age that his interests, temperament, and identity did not align with his father's expectations. While his siblings had excelled in academic subjects valued by their father and had pursued professional careers in fields like medicine, finance, and business, James had been drawn to art, photography, and creative expression. While his father had pushed him toward engineering or business programs at prestigious universities, James had wanted to study fine arts at a smaller school known for its creative programs. These differences alone had created tension, but they had been manageable while James had not yet fully confronted the question of his sexual orientation. The decisive rupture had occurred when James was 28 years old. After years of internal struggle and increasing difficulty, maintaining the pretense of conforming to his father's expectations, James had decided to live authentically. He had left a corporate marketing job that had made him miserable, but that had satisfied his father's requirements for respectable employment. He had enrolled in a photography program to develop skills he had been cultivating as a hobby. Most significantly, he had acknowledged to himself and to others that he was gay, and he had begun openly dating Daniel, whom he had met through the photography program. James had chosen to inform his family of these changes during a family dinner, believing that direct and honest communication was the appropriate approach for addressing major life decisions. The response from his father Thomas had been immediate and devastating. Thomas had reacted with anger, disappointment, and an ultimatum that reflected his rigid values and limited capacity for acceptance of paths that differed from his expectations. Thomas had told James that if he insisted on pursuing an unstable creative career and an immoral lifestyle, he was no longer welcome as part of the Reynolds family. Thomas had demanded that James either abandon these choices and return to conventional employment and expectations, or consider himself no longer his son. James, hurt and angry but also resolute in his determination to live authentically, had chosen to maintain his decisions and his integrity rather than conform to demands that required him to deny fundamental aspects of his identity and calling. He had left that family dinner expecting that his father would eventually soften. That time and continued contact with other family members would create opportunities for reconciliation. However, Thomas had enforced his ultimatum with absolute rigidity. He had refused all contact with James, had forbidden other family members from discussing James in his presence, and had removed all photographs of James from the family home. The 15 years that had followed represented a tragedy of stubbornness and pride on both sides, though the initial rupture and the sustained estrangement were primarily the result of Thomas's inflexibility and conditional love. James had reached out multiple times during the first few years of the estrangement, attempting through letters and messages conveyed through his siblings to rebuild some form of relationship with his father. Each overture had been rejected or ignored. Eventually, James had stopped attempting direct contact, concluding that his father had made a permanent choice and that continued attempts at reconciliation were only causing James additional pain and rejection. The estrangement had exacted significant costs on the entire Reynolds family. Margaret, Thomas's wife, had maintained secret contact with James throughout the 15 years, meeting with him periodically without Thomas's knowledge. She deeply missed her eldest son and grieved the relationship that had been lost, but she had felt unable to openly defy her husband or to force him to reconsider his position. Margaret carried the burden of maintaining two separate relationships and of hiding her continued connection to James from her husband, living with constant fear that Thomas would discover her deception and extend his estrangement to her as well. James's siblings, Patricia and Mark, had also maintained relationships with their brother, though these relationships had been complicated by their positions between their father and brother. Both siblings loved James and recognized that their father's treatment of him had been unjust and cruel. However, they also felt loyalty to their father and fear of losing their own relationships with him if they advocated too strongly for James or openly defied Thomas's prohibition against acknowledging James's existence. The result was that Patricia and Mark maintained contact with James, but did so carefully, never mentioning him around their father, and feeling perpetually caught between two parts of their family that should never have been divided. For James himself, the estrangement had been a source of profound pain that had diminished somewhat over the years, but had never fully healed. He had built a good life with Daniel, had established a successful photography career, and had cultivated friendships and chosen family who accepted and celebrated him fully. However, he continued to carry the wound of his father's rejection, the knowledge that his own parent had valued conformity to expectations more than he had valued his son's happiness and authenticity. James had worked through his feelings extensively in therapy, had made peace with the reality that reconciliation might never occur, but had never fully let go of the hope that his father might eventually reach out or that circumstances might create an opportunity for healing. The Family Feud appearances had been arranged separately and coincidentally. Patricia had submitted an application for her family to appear on the show, hoping that the experience would provide her father with enjoyable memories during his retirement years. She had selected family members who would participate, naturally excluding James given her father's refusal to acknowledge his existence. Separately and without any knowledge of his family's application, James had been recruited by a colleague's family who needed an additional team member for their Family Feud appearance. James had agreed to participate as a favor to his colleague, and because he thought the experience might be entertaining. Neither the production team nor the families involved had any knowledge that there was a connection between team members on opposite sides of the stage. The casting coordinators who had worked with each family separately had no reason to compare notes or to identify that two contestants shared a last name and might be related. Stage was set for a confrontation that no one had anticipated or planned, a moment when 15 years of silence and unresolved pain would manifest in the most public and uncomfortable way possible. The taping began with both families being brought to the stage separately, maintaining the element of surprise and spontaneity that characterized Family Feud's format. Thomas and his family took their positions at one podium, greeting Steve Harvey and exchanging the customary pregame pleasantries. Thomas appeared relaxed and mildly excited about the game show experience, clearly viewing the appearance as a pleasant diversion in his retirement. James and the family he was participating with were then brought to the stage to take their positions at the opposing podium. James walked out smiling and waving to the audience, entirely unprepared for what he was about to encounter. As James approached his podium and turned to face the opposing family, his eyes met his father's across the stage. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. James's smile disappeared immediately, replaced by an expression of shock that quickly shifted to visible distress. Thomas's face went pale, his body stiffening as if he had received a physical blow. The studio audience sensed immediately that something unexpected had occurred. The comfortable energy that had characterized the opening moments dissipated instantly, replaced by a tension so palpable that it affected everyone present. Steve Harvey, introducing the competing family, noticed the sudden change in atmosphere and looked between the two families trying to understand what had caused the shift. Neither Thomas nor James spoke or moved. They stood frozen, staring at each other across the 20 feet that separated their podiums. The silence that developed was not merely an absence of sound, but rather a presence unto itself, a force that seemed to press down on everyone in the studio and demand attention. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as the two men remained locked in their mutual recognition and inability to respond. Margaret, standing beside her husband, recognized immediately that her secret contact with James had suddenly been exposed in the most public way possible. Her expression showed her awareness that the separate relationships she had been maintaining would now collide, and she appeared paralyzed by fear of how Thomas would react. Patricia and Mark, also recognizing their brother, stood uncertain about how to respond. They wanted to acknowledge James, perhaps to greet him or to attempt to ease the terrible tension, but they were constrained by their father's presence and their fear of his reaction. Steve Harvey's expression shifted from confusion to concern as the silence extended. He approached the center of the stage, looking carefully at both families and attempting to understand the situation. The production team, uncertain about what was happening or how to proceed, allowed the cameras to continue rolling, recognizing that whatever was occurring was significant even if its nature was not yet clear. Finally, Steve Harvey addressed the obvious tension directly. He spoke to Thomas first, his voice carrying a gentleness that acknowledged the gravity of whatever was happening. "Sir, I can see that something significant just occurred. Are you all right? Do you know someone on the other team?" Thomas's face had shifted from shock to a hardened expression that attempted to deny the emotion clearly visible just beneath the surface. When he spoke, his voice was tight and controlled. "That is my son, James. We have not spoken in 15 years. The simple statement carried enormous weight. The studio audience gasped collectively, immediately understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding. Steve Harvey's expression showed his recognition that this was no ordinary family estrangement or minor conflict. 15 years of no contact between a father and son represented a chasm of pain and stubbornness that had consumed a significant portion of both men's lives. Steve Harvey turned to James, who stood with his arms wrapped around himself in a protective posture, his eyes filled with tears that had not yet fallen. "James, is that accurate? You and your father have not spoken in 15 years? James nodded, his voice breaking when he attempted to speak. "Yes." 15 years since he told me I was no longer his son because I refused to live the life he demanded I live. 15 years since he chose his expectations over our relationship. The pain and anger in James's voice were unmistakable, the accumulated hurt of a decade and a half compressed into a few sentences. Thomas's jaw clenched, his own anger rising to meet his son's. The tension that had been uncomfortable became almost unbearable as the two men stood separated by physical distance and by 15 years of silence, each carrying their own narrative of what had happened and who bore responsibility for the rupture that had followed. Steve Harvey, recognizing that this situation required immediate intervention rather than allowing it to escalate or to be glossed over for the sake of continuing the game, made a decision. He signaled to the production team to stop recording and to clear the studio of everyone except essential personnel. He then addressed both families directly. "We are not continuing with this game right now. What is happening between these two men is more important than Family Feud. This is about a father and son who have lost 15 years of relationship because of stubbornness, pride, and an inability to communicate. We need to address this situation before we do anything else." The clarity and authority with which Steve Harvey spoke made evident that this was not a request or suggestion, but rather a directive based on his recognition that entertainment values had to give way to addressing genuine human crisis and opportunity for healing. Steve Harvey arranged for chairs to be brought to the center of the stage. He gestured for both Thomas and James to sit, creating a physical arrangement that brought them closer together, and that shifted the dynamic from oppositional positioning at separate podiums to a configuration more conducive to actual conversation. Neither man moved initially, both appearing reluctant to alter their positions or to appear to be acquiescing to the situation. Steve Harvey addressed them both with a directness that cut through their resistance. "Gentlemen, you can continue standing there in silence, maintaining the same pattern you have followed for 15 years, or you can sit down and use this opportunity to address what has been broken between you. The choice is yours, but I am telling you right now that if you choose continued silence, you will regret this opportunity for the rest of your lives." The weight of Steve Harvey's words and the recognition that this moment represented an unexpected opportunity finally prompted both men to move. They walked slowly to the chairs and sat down, still maintaining physical distance and avoiding direct eye contact, but at least positioned in a way that made conversation possible rather than impossible. Steve Harvey pulled up a third chair and positioned himself where he could see both men. When he spoke, his tone carried both compassion and a willingness to say difficult truths that needed to be voiced. "I need both of you to understand something before we go any further. What has happened between you is a tragedy. You are father and son. You should be in each other's lives. You should know each other's joys and sorrows. You should have had 15 years of memories together. Instead, you have had 15 years of absence and silence. That is a loss that cannot be recovered, but it can be stopped from consuming more years if you are willing to do the difficult work of communication and reconciliation." He turned to Thomas first. "Sir, I am going to speak directly to you as someone who is older, as a father myself, and as someone who has seen many families destroyed by pride and inflexibility. Your son James told you 15 years ago who he was and what life he needed to live to be authentic and fulfilled. Your response was to give him an ultimatum demanding that he deny himself to meet your expectations. That was wrong. It was wrong then, and it remains wrong now. You may have values and beliefs that made acceptance difficult for you, but James is your son. That relationship, that bond, should have been more important than your discomfort or your disappointment that his life did not conform to your plans." Thomas's face showed his resistance to this characterization, his impulse to defend his position, and to reframe the narrative in a way that justified his actions. Before Thomas could interject, Steve Harvey continued with increased intensity. "You told your son that he was no longer your son. Do you understand the cruelty and permanence of those words? Do you comprehend what it means to reject your child completely, to remove him from your family and your life as if he never existed? You took away his family, his sense of belonging, his connection to parents and siblings. You enforced that absence for 15 years, refusing his attempts at contact, erasing his presence from your home. That is a choice you made every single day for 15 years, and it is a choice that has caused profound pain not just to James, but to everyone in your family who has been forced to navigate this artificial division." The studio remained completely silent as Steve Harvey spoke, every person present recognizing the power and truth in his words. Thomas sat with his head bowed, his resistance beginning to crack as the reality of what he had done was named so directly and unequivocally. Steve Harvey then turned to James, and his voice softened while maintaining its honesty. James, I want you to hear something as well. Your father's rejection was wrong, and the pain you have carried is real and justified. However, I also want you to consider that holding on to anger and hurt for 15 years has cost you as well. You have had to carry the weight of that rejection, and it has affected your life in ways that may not always be visible. The question now is whether you are willing to consider the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with your father, not because you need to forgive and forget everything that happened, but because having that relationship might be better for you than continuing to live without it. James looked up at Steve Harvey, tears now flowing freely down his face. When James spoke, his voice carried 15 years of accumulated pain given voice for the first time in his father's presence. I needed him to love me for who I am, not for who he wanted me to be. I needed him to be proud of me for building a life with meaning and authenticity, even if that life did not look like what he had planned. I needed him to meet Daniel, to see how much we love each other, to understand that my relationship is real and valid and deserving of respect. Instead, he called my life immoral, called me a disappointment, and erased me from his family. How do I get past that? How do I trust that he has changed, or that attempting reconciliation will not just result in more rejection and pain? The vulnerability and hurt in James's words created a moment of profound emotional truth. The question James had asked was not rhetorical but genuine, reflecting the core fear that prevented him from initiating reconciliation, even if part of him desired it. Steve Harvey allowed the question to hang in the air, understanding that Thomas needed to hear it fully before any response could be offered. Finally, Steve Harvey addressed Thomas again, his voice quiet but insistent. Sir, your son just told you what he needed from you 15 years ago and what he still needs from you now. He needs to know that you love him unconditionally, that you are proud of who he is rather than disappointed that he is not who you wanted him to be, that you recognize the value in the life he has built. Can you offer him that? Can you acknowledge that your rejection was wrong and that you are willing to work toward rebuilding what has been lost? The tension in the studio reached its apex in the silence that followed Steve Harvey's question. Everyone present understood that this was the moment that would determine whether 15 years of estrangement would continue or whether healing might begin. Thomas sat motionless, his face showing the internal struggle between his pride, his ingrained beliefs, and the growing recognition of what his choices had cost him and his family. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he had suppressed for years. The words came slowly, each one appearing to require enormous effort. I told myself for 15 years that I was right, that I had maintained principles, that James had been the one who chose to leave the family by refusing to conform to what I believed was the right path. I told myself that I had no regrets, that my life was better without the conflict and disappointment. Thomas paused, wiping his eyes roughly. But I have been lying to myself. I have regretted it every single day. I have thought about James constantly, wondered what he was doing, whether he was happy, whether he ever thought about his family. I have missed my son in ways I could not acknowledge, because acknowledging the loss meant acknowledging that I had caused it through my own rigidity and conditional love. The admission represented a breakthrough, the first crack in the wall that Thomas had constructed to protect himself from recognizing the consequences of his choices. James sat listening, his expression showing cautious hope mixed with continued wariness. Steve Harvey pressed further, recognizing that generalized regret was not sufficient. What specifically do you regret? What do you recognize now that you did not understand or accept 15 years ago? Thomas took a shaking breath and looked directly at James for the first time since sitting down. I regret telling you that you are no longer my son. I regret demanding that you deny who you are to maintain my approval. I regret refusing your attempts to contact me over the years. I regret all the time we have lost. And I recognize now that my love for you should never have been conditional on your conforming to my expectations. You are my son regardless of what career you choose or who you love. That should have been enough. It should have always been enough. The words, spoken directly to James for the first time in 15 years, represented not just an apology but an acknowledgement of fundamental error in Thomas's approach to parenting and relationship. James sat crying openly, processing the words he had needed to hear for so long, but had stopped believing he would ever receive. Steve Harvey, recognizing that this breakthrough was fragile and required careful navigation to transform into genuine reconciliation, facilitated the conversation that followed. He asked Thomas to tell James what his life had been like over the past 15 years, what he had missed by refusing contact with his son. Thomas, with increasing openness, shared that he had retired 3 years earlier and had found retirement difficult and isolating. He spoke about medical issues he had faced and how he had wished James could have been present during those frightening times. He acknowledged that he had attended family events for Patricia and Mark, had celebrated grandchildren and milestones, but that each celebration had been marked by James's absence, by the knowledge that the family was incomplete. Steve Harvey then asked James to share his life with his father, to help Thomas understand what he had missed by maintaining the estrangement. James spoke about his photography career, describing projects he had worked on that had been meaningful and impactful. He showed his father photographs on his phone of award-winning work he had produced, work that told stories about communities and individuals in ways that created understanding and empathy. James also spoke about Daniel, describing their relationship with a tenderness that made evident the depth of their partnership. He explained that Daniel had encouraged him to remain open to reconciliation with his father, even when James had been tempted to give up entirely on the possibility. The conversation extended for over an hour, with Steve Harvey occasionally asking questions or offering observations, but primarily creating space for the two men to communicate directly about 15 years of experiences, feelings, and missed opportunities. Margaret, Thomas's wife, participated in the conversation at Steve Harvey's invitation, sharing her perspective about maintaining secret contact with James and the toll that the division had taken on her and on the entire family. Patricia and Mark also spoke, expressing their relief that the silence might finally be ending and their hope that the family could be whole again. The Family Feud episode never aired as a game show segment. The production team recognized that what had been captured was far more significant than entertainment, and they worked with the Reynolds family to determine how the footage might be used constructively. The network eventually produced a documentary special about estrangement between parents and LGBTQ children, using Thomas and James's story as the centerpiece, but expanding to address the broader issues of conditional love, family rejection of LGBTQ individuals, and paths toward reconciliation and healing. The reconciliation between Thomas and James was not instantaneous or complete in that moment on the Family Feud stage. 15 years of separation and pain could not be erased by a single conversation, however powerful and honest that conversation might be. Instead, the Family Feud confrontation represented the beginning of a long process of rebuilding trust, establishing new patterns of communication, and healing wounds that had been festering for years. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas and James engaged in regular conversations, facilitated initially by a family therapist who specialized in reconciliation between parents and estranged LGBTQ children. These sessions were difficult and emotionally demanding, requiring both men to confront painful truths, to acknowledge their own contributions to the estrangement, and to develop new ways of relating to each other that honored both James's authentic identity and Thomas's ongoing process of growth and acceptance. Thomas worked to educate himself about LGBTQ issues, reading books and articles recommended by the therapist and by James, attending P-flag meetings for parents of LGBTQ children, and confronting the beliefs and prejudices that had prevented him from accepting his son years earlier. The process was humbling and painful for Thomas, requiring him to acknowledge that his values and expectations had been less important than his relationship with his son, and that his rigidity had cost him and his family 15 years of connection and love. James worked to rebuild trust in his father while also protecting himself from potential ray injury. He moved slowly in opening his life to his father again, gradually introducing Thomas to Daniel and eventually inviting Thomas to spend time with them as a couple. Each interaction represented a small step toward rebuilding the relationship, with James carefully observing whether Thomas's expressed acceptance translated into genuine comfort and respect in his behavior and interactions. 6 months after the Family Feud encounter, Thomas and Margaret attended their first family event with James and Daniel present. Patricia hosted a holiday gathering where all the Reynolds family members came together for the first time in 15 years. The event was emotional and somewhat awkward, but it represented a milestone in the family's healing process. Thomas spoke briefly during the gathering, thanking James publicly for being willing to give him another chance, and expressing his hope that they could build new memories together to partially offset the years that had been lost. 1 year after the Family Feud encounter, Thomas and James appeared together in the documentary special, speaking about their estrangement and their ongoing reconciliation process. Both men acknowledged that the relationship was still being rebuilt and that challenges remained, but both expressed gratitude that they had been given the opportunity to attempt reconciliation rather than allowing the silence to continue until death made restoration impossible. Thomas spoke in the documentary about the cost of his conditional love and his ultimatum. He expressed deep regret for the years lost and for the pain he had caused not just to James but to his entire family. He shared that meeting Daniel had transformed his understanding of his son's relationship, that seeing the love and commitment between James and Daniel had made undeniable the legitimacy and value of their partnership. Thomas acknowledged that he still had work to do to fully overcome the prejudices that had been so deeply ingrained, but he committed publicly to continuing that work because his relationship with his son mattered more than his comfort or his resistance to change. James spoke about the pain of rejection by his father, the years of wondering whether reconciliation was possible, and the fear he had experienced even as he began to rebuild the relationship that his father might withdraw again if James's life or choices became too challenging for Thomas to accept. However, James also expressed cautious hope that the reconciliation would continue to deepen, and that eventually his father would become not just accepting but genuinely supportive of all aspects of James's life. The documentary became an important resource for families dealing with estrangement related to LGBTQ identity and acceptance. Organizations supporting LGBTQ youth and their families reported increased calls and requests for resources following the documentary's airing. Many parents reached out specifically mentioning Thomas and James's story as prompting them to reconsider their own estrangements from LGBTQ children and to seek paths toward reconciliation before more years were lost. Before concluding, if this story moved you, or if you recognize the importance of unconditional love and family reconciliation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Organizations like PFLAG provide support for families navigating these difficult dynamics. Share this video to encourage others to break through silence and to prioritize relationship over pride or inflexible expectations. 3 years after the Family Feud encounter, Thomas and James had established a relationship that, while not identical to what might have developed had there been no estrangement, was genuine and growing. Thomas had become a regular presence in James and Daniel's life, attending their events, celebrating their achievements, and functioning as an involved father in ways he had not been for 15 years. James reported feeling increasingly secure in his father's acceptance and increasingly able to trust that the reconciliation was permanent rather than temporary or conditional. The story of the tension that built until Steve Harvey broke the silence remained a powerful example of the cost of pride and inflexibility in family relationships and the possibility of healing even after years of estrangement. Steve Harvey's willingness to stop the show and to facilitate difficult conversation rather than avoiding or minimizing the conflict demonstrated the importance of addressing family ruptures directly rather than allowing them to fester indefinitely. The Reynolds family's journey from complete estrangement to gradual reconciliation provided hope to countless other families dealing with similar divisions, proving that while silence and separation carry enormous costs, communication and willingness to change can create paths toward restoration even after years of seemingly insurmountable division.